Hey folks, there's all this talk about how awful the Soviet Union was. We hear this in the USA all the time. The Soviet Union was awful, we're told. And all those people that will go on and on and on about how awful the Soviet Union was, you'll notice they never talk about the fall of the Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union was far worse than anything anyone even alleged about the Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union was an economic catastrophe. Mass unemployment, sometimes 20, sometimes even 30% in the 1990s. You had a country that was a world industrial center that was basically economically destroyed. Roughly 80% of the farms going bankrupt. Huge numbers of factories, hundreds of thousands of factories closing their doors and laying off the workers. The sex trafficking, that was one thing. They didn't have that in the former Soviet Union. As bad as these people like to make the Soviet Union out to be, they didn't have sex trafficking. Well, sex trafficking was all over Eastern Europe and all over Russia in the 1990s. Heroin flowed in at huge rates. The fall of the Soviet Union was a catastrophe, economically speaking. The standard of living of the people drastically decreased. The population of Russia actually went down by roughly 10% during the early 1990s. People talk about the 1990s, the term economic genocide is used to describe what went on in Russia during the 1990s when free market Western capitalism was imposed on Russia. And furthermore, there's all this talk about Russian meddling in U.S. elections. Well, U.S. officials bragged about the fact that they meddled and worked very hard to make sure the man who was overseeing the looting of Russia by Western corporations, Boris Yeltsin, was reelected. Bill Clinton brags about everything he did to make sure that Boris Yeltsin got reelected as Russia's president. They did everything they could to keep this free market capitalist who was letting BP and HSBC Bank and big corporations just demolish the place economically. So all these people that want to go on and on and on about how bad the Soviet Union was, and sure, the Soviet Union had problems. Obviously, it collapsed. You can't say it's a perfect system, and clearly, the socialism that's now being practiced in China, the socialism that's being practiced in Venezuela, Ecuador, Nicaragua, places like that, has been adjusted. That Soviet model clearly had a lot of problems. It was not sustainable. We saw that in the fall of the Soviet Union. But if you think that this proves somehow that capitalism is better, look at what happened during the 1990s. And how was it fixed up? Let's talk about that. How was Russia's economy restored from the disaster of the 1990s? What did they do? Did they privatize more things? No. Russia's economy vastly improved because Putin nationalized the oil and natural gas. Russia at this point has an economy that is centered around two huge state-run oil and natural gas companies. We got Gazprom and Rosneft. So this idea that somehow the experience of the Soviet Union proves that capitalism is superior, that's a ridiculous assessment of the period. And despite all the problems the Soviet Union had, who was the first country to enter outer space? What country was producing more steel than any other country in the world during the Great Depression? How did a whole country go from having almost no running water and electricity to being fully electrified, universal literacy, modern housing? The country was modernized with Stalin's 5-year plans. It became a world industrial power and a world superpower. Russia became a superpower because of what went on when it had a socialist government, when it was led by a Marxist-Leninist party. So this entire assessment of Soviet history that we hear, that, they were poor and starving, and then in 1990 they got free, the economic history of that country is quite different. What went on in the 1990s when Jeffrey Sachs and the free market economists from Columbia University were running the place was a disaster. And the only way it's been restored has been by reasserting state control. State control over vital natural resources. So everything you think you know, I'm so tired of hearing this from people. They say, oh, the Soviet Union fell, the Soviet Union was awful. These people just don't know what they're talking about. And they say it with such confidence. And that's what's so annoying about it. Let's talk about what really went on. It's very annoying to hear these people.